If you pay tribute today, your children will spend the rest of their lives calling someone else master. The words landed in the chamber before the translator drones could even finish processing them. A wave of uneasy whispers spread through the Grand Assembly as more than 100 alien delegations turned toward the small Terran table near the back of the hall. The room itself had been designed to overwhelm visitors. Towering crystal columns stretched hundreds of feet overhead. Floating banners displayed the emblems of civilizations that had ruled entire sectors for thousands of years. Every seat facing the central platform had been filled hours before the session began, because everyone wanted to witness the same moment. Humanity's surrender. High Chancellor Marcus Veyron slowly rose from his elevated throne, folded his four hands behind his back, and smiled with the quiet confidence of someone who had never heard the word no. "Representatives of Earth," he announced, his voice echoing across the chamber. "Your world has prospered under the protection of this council. Today that balance changes. Beginning immediately, Earth will provide annual tribute in raw materials, industrial production, and labor allocations. Compliance guarantees continued peace. Refusal will carry consequences." No one gasped. No one protested. Around the room, delegates nodded as if this were simply another administrative matter. To them, this was not theft. It was order. Humanity was young, isolated, and far too small to challenge the oldest powers in known space. At the Terran table, Ambassador Daniel Harper adjusted the cuff of his navy blue suit before reaching for a leather notebook that looked almost laughably old among the holographic displays surrounding him. He uncapped a fountain pen, wrote a single sentence, closed the notebook, and looked back toward the Chancellor. His Chief of Staff, Rebecca Collins, leaned closer without taking her eyes off the platform. "They're expecting you to argue," she whispered. Daniel gave the slightest shake of his head. "No," he replied quietly. "They're expecting me to panic." Rebecca knew him well enough to recognize the difference. His heartbeat wasn't racing. His breathing hadn't changed. But there was something behind his calm expression that only people who had worked beside him for years could see. He had already made a decision. Across the chamber, Chancellor Veyron spread his arms. "Does the Terran Alliance acknowledge the authority of this decree?" Every camera pivoted toward Daniel. Billions across dozens of star systems watched the live broadcast. Reporters prepared headlines before he even stood. Markets fluctuated. Military analysts waited for signs of surrender. Daniel rose slowly, buttoned his jacket, and looked around the enormous chamber before speaking. "I have one question," he said. The translator repeated his words in hundreds of languages. Veyron smiled. "Proceed." Daniel met his eyes without blinking. "Is this your final offer?" Laughter erupted across the assembly. Several delegates openly mocked the human. One ambassador nearly spilled his drink while another leaned back, amused that such a small species still believed negotiation was possible. Veyron allowed the laughter to continue before raising one hand for silence. "There is no offer, Ambassador Harper," he answered. "There is only compliance." Daniel nodded once, as though confirming an appointment on his calendar. "Understood." He gathered his notebook, thanked the Chancellor with perfect politeness, and resumed his seat. Rebecca stared at him in disbelief. "That's it?" she asked under her breath. Daniel looked toward the massive council seal hanging above the platform. "No," he said softly. "That's the moment they'll remember as the beginning." 3 weeks earlier, long before the council chamber filled with cameras and applause, the decision had already been made. Not by Earth, but by those who believed Earth would eventually kneel. Inside the Council Intelligence Directorate, a classified assessment circulated through the highest offices. The report described humanity as economically productive, politically divided, and strategically dependent on interstellar trade. It concluded with one sentence that every senior official repeated without questioning. Pressure would achieve compliance without armed conflict. Chancellor Marcus Veyron signed the final page with complete confidence. Around the polished conference table, military advisors and economic ministers quietly agreed. One by one, they explained why Earth had become the perfect target. Humanity had no ancient empire stretching across the stars. Their colonies were modest. Their fleets rarely appeared beyond commercial shipping lanes. They spent more money rebuilding frontier settlements than expanding their military presence. To the Council, that looked like weakness. Admiral Sorak pointed toward a rotating star map. "If they refuse, we block 3 trade corridors." Their manufacturing slows within 60 days. Their civilian markets panic within 90. They will return asking for revised terms before the first year ends. Another official smiled. Humans always negotiate. They value comfort too much to risk uncertainty. Nobody challenged the assumption. Nobody asked why a species born on a world famous for hurricanes, earthquakes, droughts, and brutal winters had somehow become incapable of hardship. Thousands of light years away, Daniel Harper sat alone inside the Terran embassy overlooking the capital skyline. His office was almost disappointingly ordinary. Framed family photographs rested beside shelves filled with legal books instead of military trophies. A ceramic coffee mug from Denver sat beside a stack of briefing folders. Rebecca Collins stepped inside carrying another intelligence packet. "The latest council media coverage," she said. "Every network is predicting we will compromise." Daniel accepted the folder but did not open it. Instead, he looked toward the photograph of his wife, Emily, standing beside their teenage daughter, Grace, during a camping trip in Yellowstone National Park. Rebecca noticed the picture and smiled. "Grace still planning on Stanford?" Daniel nodded. "If this week goes well, she will be worried about college applications instead of history books." Rebecca leaned against the desk. "And if it does not?" Daniel let the silence answer first. "Then she grows up in a different world than the one I promised her." His voice stayed calm, but the weight behind those words settled heavily across the room. Rebecca had worked beside him for almost 12 years. She knew he was not fearless. He simply refused to let fear make decisions for him. She slid another document across the desk. "Our analysts intercepted another council projection. They are convinced we will request concessions within 48 hours. Daniel finally opened the folder and quietly read several pages before closing it again. A faint smile crossed his face. "They are studying our economy," he said. "They should have been studying our history." Rebecca folded her arms. "You already know what they are going to demand, do not you?" Daniel looked out the window where civilian transports crossed the evening sky in slow, peaceful lines. "Every detail. Then why not stop it before it reaches the assembly?" Daniel picked up his coffee, now cold, and took one small sip anyway. Because sometimes people only understand the truth after they say something they cannot take back. Rebecca followed his gaze toward the horizon. For the first time since joining the diplomatic service, she realized Daniel had never been trying to avoid a confrontation. He had simply been waiting for the council to choose it first. The council reconvened the following morning with the confidence of people who believed the outcome had already been decided. Reporters filled the upper galleries. Political commentators whispered predictions into recording drones. Across the known systems, billions watched the live broadcast expecting humanity to begin bargaining. Instead, they watched Daniel Harper quietly organize a thin stack of printed papers while everyone else relied on glowing displays. Chancellor Marcus Veyron glanced toward the human delegation with an almost friendly smile. "Ambassador Harper," he said, "we trust your government has reached a reasonable conclusion." Daniel stood without rushing. "Earth has completed its review." The Chancellor nodded. "Excellent. Then let us proceed." Before Daniel could continue, representatives from dozens of member worlds requested permission to speak. One after another, they praised the proposed tribute agreement. Some described it as necessary for regional stability. Others insisted it would help humanity become a responsible member of the galactic community. A trade minister from the inner colonies even claimed the arrangement would create new opportunities for Earth. Daniel listened without interrupting. He wrote occasional notes with the same fountain pen that had puzzled the chamber the day before. Rebecca Collins leaned toward him. "They rehearsed every speech," she whispered. "Weeks ago." Daniel did not look up from the page. "Of course they did. Should we answer any of it?" "Not yet." Nearly 2 hours passed before the final speaker returned to his seat. Chancellor Veyron folded his hands together. "The Assembly has spoken with remarkable unity. Humanity has been given a fair path forward." Daniel slowly closed his notebook and walked toward the center podium. Every camera followed him. Every translation system activated. He placed a single printed document on the polished surface. "Before I respond," he began, "I would like the record to reflect that every statement made today was voluntary and entered without coercion." The chief clerk looked surprised by the request, but nodded. "So recorded." Daniel continued. I would also like confirmation that the proposed tribute policy represents the official and unanimous position of this council. Veyron answered without hesitation. It does, including all legal obligations attached to this decision. Naturally, several delegates exchanged curious looks. The questions sounded procedural, almost boring. Many stopped paying attention. Daniel thanked the clerk and returned to his seat without another word. Confused murmurs spread through the chamber. Rebecca frowned. That is all, she asked quietly. Daniel slipped the duplicate copy of the signed record into his leather portfolio. That is everything I needed. You just made them certify their own position. Exactly. Rebecca looked toward the council platform where advisors were already congratulating one another. None of them seemed concerned. None of them realized the human ambassador had spent the entire session building a legal foundation instead of an emotional argument. Daniel glanced around the chamber one last time. He saw satisfied smiles, relieved investors, relaxed military observers, and politicians already celebrating a victory that existed only in their own expectations. Then he quietly stood again. Rebecca, he said as they prepared to leave for the scheduled recess. History rarely changes because someone raises their voice. She looked at him. Then how does it change? Daniel rested one hand on his portfolio. Usually because someone signs the wrong piece of paper and realizes it far too late. The moment the recess was announced, the noise inside the assembly returned like a crowded airport after a delayed flight. Delegates gathered into small circles, reporters rushed to secure interviews, and financial analysts flooded every public channel with predictions that Earth would sign the agreement before the day was over. Daniel Harper ignored all of it. He picked up his leather portfolio, nodded politely to a few passing diplomats, and walked toward the Terran embassy offices without changing his pace. Rebecca Collins followed close behind, waiting until the heavy security door sealed shut before speaking. The room is clear, she said after checking the privacy indicators. Daniel looked around the conference room anyway. Old habits were difficult to break. He placed his portfolio on the table, loosened his tie, and finally let out a slow breath that he had been holding for hours. The calm public diplomat disappeared. In his place stood a man carrying the weight of an entire planet. Status, he said. Rebecca opened a secure tablet that remained disconnected from every council network. No leaks. No unusual surveillance inside the embassy. However, Council intelligence increased monitoring around our communications hub 30 minutes ago. Daniel nodded. As expected, a quiet knock interrupted them. The embassy security director, Michael Donovan, stepped inside carrying a sealed envelope instead of an electronic device. Hand-delivered, he said. Just arrived through diplomatic courier. Daniel opened it immediately. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing only a few lines. He read it once, folded it, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Rebecca watched his face carefully. Good news. The confirmation I was waiting for. Michael looked between them. Should I notify Washington? Daniel shook his head. Not Washington. He walked to the secure communications console mounted against the far wall. Unlike every advanced system inside the council complex, this one relied on an isolated quantum network designed years earlier for situations exactly like this. Daniel entered a long authentication sequence from memory. The screen remained black for several seconds before a single line appeared. Authentication verified. He did not ask for the president. He did not request the Secretary of State. Instead, he selected one encrypted contact that almost nobody outside Earth even knew existed. A calm voice answered. Strategic Command. Daniel spoke clearly. This is Ambassador Daniel Harper. Confirm Protocol Liberty. Stage 1. There was a pause lasting less than 2 seconds. Protocol Liberty. Stage 1 confirmed. Estimated readiness? Already complete. Daniel closed his eyes for the briefest moment. Thank you. The connection ended without another word. Rebecca stared at the silent monitor. That was shorter than ordering takeout. Daniel allowed himself a faint smile. The most important conversations usually are. Michael crossed his arms. So it begins. Daniel looked toward the embassy window where civilian traffic continued moving peacefully through the evening sky. Families were eating dinner. Children were finishing homework. Office workers were heading home, believing tomorrow would look exactly like today. He hoped they would never know how close everything had come to changing. No, he said quietly. It began years ago. Today the council simply decided to notice. Rebecca stepped beside him. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if they had treated us like equals? Daniel watched the lights of the Capitol shimmer across the skyline before answering. Then none of what comes next would have been necessary. For the next 3 days, the council waited for Earth to blink. Every major news network across known space repeated the same prediction. Human markets would collapse. Political pressure would build. Business leaders would demand compromise. Commentators invited retired admirals, economists, and historians who all reached the same conclusion. Earth had no practical choice except negotiation. The confidence was almost comforting. It allowed the council to celebrate before anything had actually happened. Chancellor Marcus Veyron spent those days accepting congratulations from allied governments. Several ambassadors privately thanked him for resolving what they called the human question without firing a single shot. Even the financial exchanges reacted exactly as expected. Commodity prices shifted. Shipping companies rerouted cargo. Investors quietly prepared for Earth to become another dependent economy inside the council system. Yet something refused to fit the pattern. Earth did nothing. No emergency broadcasts appeared. No desperate diplomatic requests arrived. No military convoys rushed toward the frontier. Commercial freighters continued following their schedules. Universities remained open. Sporting events were played as planned. Families went to work, children went to school, and restaurants filled with customers discussing ordinary life instead of impending crisis. Intelligence officers studying Earth became increasingly uncomfortable. One analyst reported, civilian behavior remains statistically normal. Another added, no unusual troop movement, no strategic withdrawals, no panic buying, no disruptions to domestic infrastructure. Inside the Terran embassy, Daniel Harper finally allowed himself one quiet evening away from briefing documents. He sat alone in his office after sunset, holding his cell phone before pressing the familiar contact labeled home. The call connected after only 2 rings. Dad. Grace answered with her usual energy. You finally remembered I exist. Daniel smiled for the first time all day. I was hoping your mother had not convinced you to replace me. Grace laughed. Not yet. Mom says you still owe us a camping trip. Emily's voice appeared in the background. Tell your father dinner is getting cold, even if he is 6,000 light years away. Daniel leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes as their voices filled the quiet office. They talked about Grace's college applications, the neighbor's new golden retriever that kept digging under the fence, and the tomato plants Emily insisted would survive another hot Colorado summer. It sounded wonderfully ordinary. That was exactly why Daniel treasured every second. When the conversation ended, he remained staring at the dark screen for a long moment. Rebecca Collins knocked softly before stepping inside. She immediately noticed the expression on his face. Everything all right? Daniel nodded slowly. They are doing exactly what families are supposed to do. Rebecca sat across from him. And what are we supposed to do? Daniel rested the phone beside the framed photograph of Emily and Grace. Make sure they never have to think about tribute, intimidation, or someone deciding their future from a room they have never seen. Rebecca studied him carefully. Were you scared when you called them? Daniel answered honestly. Every parent is scared when the future becomes uncertain. Then why do you still sound so calm? He looked toward the embassy window where another peaceful night settled over the capital world. Because courage is not the absence of fear, he said quietly. It is choosing not to hand that fear to the people counting on you. Outside, the council celebrated what it believed was an inevitable victory. Inside the embassy, the silence remained unbroken, but it was no longer the silence of hesitation. It was the silence of people who had already accepted the cost of the decision they were about to make. The deadline arrived without ceremony. There were no warning sirens, no emergency broadcasts, and no dramatic speeches waiting outside the assembly doors. The council expected confidence, and confidence was exactly what filled the chamber. Delegates greeted one another with relaxed smiles. Some discussed vacation plans after the session concluded. Others quietly celebrated what they believed would become a landmark diplomatic victory. Chancellor Marcus Veyron entered to warm applause before taking his place above the assembly floor. He glanced toward the Terran delegation and noticed nothing had changed. Daniel Harper still wore the same navy blue suit. Rebecca Collins still organized a neat stack of papers. Michael Donovan stood quietly behind them, expressionless as always. Veyron smiled. Ambassador Harper, the compliance deadline has now expired. Has your government reached its decision? Daniel stood without hesitation. It has. Every conversation inside the chamber stopped. Camera drones floated closer until they surrounded the central podium. Across the galaxy, billions waited for the words everyone believed they already knew. Daniel picked up a plain white folder instead of activating a holographic display. He walked to the center of the chamber and placed the folder gently on the polished podium. The chief clerk reached for it automatically. "Please enter the Terran response into the official record," Daniel said. The clerk opened the folder and frowned. He looked at the first page, then the second, before his eyes widened in visible confusion. "Ambassador," he said carefully, "I believe there has been some mistake." Daniel remained calm. "There has been no mistake." Chancellor Veyron leaned forward. "Read the submission." The clerk swallowed once before speaking into the chamber microphone. "Official declaration from the Terran Alliance to the Galactic Council. Effective immediately, the Terran Alliance rejects all tribute demands and recognizes the Council's certified resolution as an act of unlawful coercion under Articles 9, 12, and 21 of the Galactic Charter. In accordance with those provisions, the Terran Alliance formally declares a lawful state of war against all participating authorities responsible for the resolution." Silence arrived so suddenly that even the translation systems seemed to hesitate. Several delegates stared at one another, convinced they had heard the wrong translation. Others quickly checked their personal displays, searching for an error that did not exist. Veyron slowly rose from his chair. "Ambassador Harper," he said in a measured voice, "surely you understand the meaning of the document you have submitted." Daniel met his eyes. "I do. You are declaring war against the oldest governing body in known civilization." "No," Daniel replied quietly. "Your council declared that our freedom could be purchased. We are simply responding to your decision." Murmurs spread through every level of the assembly. One delegate stood and shouted, "Humanity cannot possibly believe it can prevail." Daniel turned toward the voice with the same calm expression he had carried since the first session. "Winning was never the first objective," he answered. "Making sure our children never inherit obedience was." Rebecca watched the chamber transform before her eyes. 3 days earlier, these same officials had laughed at Earth. Now nobody was laughing. Advisors hurried between seats. Military representatives whispered into secure communicators. Market analysts rushed out of the galleries. Chancellor Veyron stared at the document resting on the podium as though it belonged to someone else. Daniel quietly returned to the Terran table, adjusted the sleeve of his jacket, and folded his hands. The council had expected negotiation until the final minute. Instead, they had received something they had not prepared for at all. The first move had finally been made, and for the first time since the crisis began, uncertainty no longer belonged to Earth. The shock inside the assembly had barely settled before the first emergency alerts began flashing across the council network. At first, everyone assumed it was coincidence. A routine systems notice, a navigation update. Then another alert appeared, and another. Within less than 60 seconds, military aides abandoned their seats and hurried toward their commanders. Secure communication channels that normally remained silent during diplomatic sessions suddenly filled with urgent requests for verification. Chancellor Marcus Veyron frowned as one of his senior advisors approached and quietly handed him a data tablet. The color drained from the advisor's face before he spoke. "Sir, we have lost live telemetry from 14 frontier task forces." Veyron barely looked up. "Communication failure? We do not know. Restore the links." "We have tried." Around the chamber, similar conversations unfolded almost simultaneously. Representatives from different member worlds were receiving nearly identical reports. Patrol groups had disappeared from the tactical network. Supply convoys had stopped responding. Long-range sensor stations were requesting immediate confirmation orders because familiar traffic patterns had changed without warning. There were no distress calls, no explosions, no evidence of attacks, only silence. The kind of silence professional officers feared the most. Rebecca Collins glanced toward Daniel Harper, expecting at least a hint of satisfaction. Instead, he calmly turned another page in his notebook as though reviewing meeting minutes from an ordinary committee hearing. "Did you know this would happen today?" she asked quietly. Daniel answered without looking up. "I knew the timing would be close." "You are not surprised?" "No. Are you going to explain it?" Daniel closed the notebook. "Not yet. Across the room, Admiral Sorak stood so quickly that his chair slid backward across the polished floor. "This is impossible," he said. 14 fleets cannot simply disappear. A communications officer hurried toward him. "Admiral, they have not disappeared. They are stationary." Sorak frowned. "Stationary?" "Yes, sir. Every vessel remains intact according to passive sensors, but none of them are moving. None are transmitting. None are answering encrypted command signals." Confused voices spread throughout the assembly. One delegate suggested sabotage. Another blamed a stellar anomaly. A third insisted the Terrans had somehow launched a cyber attack, but no supporting evidence existed. Daniel remained completely still. Chancellor Veyron finally addressed him directly. "Ambassador Harper, if your government possesses information relevant to these developments, this council expects immediate disclosure." Daniel slowly stood. Every eye in the chamber returned to him once again. "Chancellor," he replied evenly. 3 days ago your government informed the galaxy that coercion was an acceptable diplomatic tool. Today you are discovering that assumptions can be equally dangerous." Veyron's expression hardened. "Answer the question." Daniel nodded politely. "Very well. Earth has not attacked your fleets." A ripple of relieved whispers swept through the chamber before Daniel continued. "Earth simply stopped helping them." Silence returned. Several officials looked at one another, unable to understand the statement. Daniel spoke with the calm patience of a teacher explaining something obvious. "For the past 12 years, Terran navigation software has quietly managed deep space gravitational corrections for commercial traffic across shared council routes. Our engineers designed the predictive algorithms because no one else wanted to solve the problem. Your fleets integrated those systems years ago because they were efficient." Rebecca watched realization begin spreading across the faces of senior officers. Daniel continued. "When your governments declared that Earth existed only to serve, you also declared that our cooperation no longer mattered. Strategic Command accepted that decision." Nobody interrupted him now. Nobody laughed. For the first time since the assembly convened, the Council understood that humanity's greatest contribution had never been its warships. It had been the invisible foundation everyone else had forgotten they were standing on. The atmosphere inside the assembly had completely changed. Only an hour earlier, the delegates had spoken with the confidence of victors, discussing administrative details. Now every conversation sounded cautious. Military officers stood shoulder to shoulder with economic advisors. Trade ministers ignored their own reports as they waited for updates from distant sectors. No one was celebrating anymore. Chancellor Marcus Veyron remained standing behind the central podium, reading message after message as they arrived across his private display. Each report answered one question while creating 3 new ones. The fleets had not been destroyed. Their crews were safe. Their engines still functioned. Their weapons remained operational. Yet none of them could reliably navigate the shared gravitational corridors they had depended on for more than a decade. Long-distance travel that normally required hours now carried unacceptable risks because the predictive guidance models were no longer updating. Entire logistics schedules collapsed in real time. Freight carriers requested emergency docking. Relief shipments stopped moving. Passenger liners delayed departures. Insurance exchanges suspended coverage until navigation reliability could be verified. The galaxy had not been attacked. It had simply become slower overnight. Rebecca Collins quietly watched the unfolding reports with growing disbelief. "They built everything around us," she whispered. Daniel Harper nodded. "Not around us. Around what we quietly maintained." She looked at him. "Why did nobody realize it?" Daniel answered with a tired smile. "Because when something works every single day, people eventually stop asking who keeps it working." Across the chamber, Admiral Sorak stepped toward the center floor holding a stack of technical assessments. "Our engineers have reviewed the navigation systems," he announced. "The predictive algorithms were licensed from Terran Research Consortiums years ago. Every member fleet integrated the software because it reduced fuel consumption and improved route safety by nearly 20%. Murmurs spread through the delegates. A commerce representative looked genuinely confused. "Then restore the license." Sorak slowly shook his head. "The software has not failed. Earth revoked operational authorization under clauses contained in the original contracts." Several legal advisors immediately began searching archived agreements. One finally looked up with disbelief. The authorization can be withdrawn during declared hostilities. Daniel quietly folded his hands on the desk. He had written those clauses himself nearly 11 years earlier after insisting that every strategic technology exported by Earth remain under civilian legal protection. At the time, most council lawyers had dismissed the language as unnecessary paperwork. Now those forgotten paragraphs had become the center of an interstellar crisis. Chancellor Veyron looked directly at Daniel. "You prepared this long before today's session." Daniel answered honestly. "We prepared for the possibility that cooperation might someday become coercion." "You anticipated betrayal." "No," Daniel corrected gently. "We anticipated that someone might mistake our willingness to help for permanent obligation." Silence settled once more. This time it was different. It was not confusion. It was recognition. Delegate after delegate began seeing the same pattern. Earth had never tried to dominate anyone. Human engineers had solved difficult problems because solving problems was what they did. Human manufacturers had supplied dependable parts because reliability built trust. Human programmers had shared infrastructure because cooperation benefited everyone. None of those contributions had been demanded. They had been offered freely. The Council had mistaken generosity for dependence. They believed humanity needed the galaxy more than the galaxy needed humanity. Daniel looked across the chamber filled with worried faces and realized the balance had already shifted. No fleet had fired a single shot. No city had fallen. Yet every delegate in that room finally understood the same uncomfortable truth. The strongest foundation is often the one nobody notices until it is gone. The emergency session lasted well into the evening, but by then everyone understood that the meeting was no longer about forcing Earth to accept new terms. It had become a desperate search for a way back. Delegates who had proudly endorsed the tribute resolution only days before now quietly avoided one another's eyes. Economic ministers warned that every additional hour without restored navigation support would ripple through thousands of worlds. Hospital shipments were arriving late. Agricultural deliveries were backing up at orbital stations. Manufacturing schedules were slipping. None of it had happened because humanity wanted revenge. It had happened because trust, once broken, stopped carrying everything that depended on it. Chancellor Marcus Veyron remained silent for a long time before finally stepping away from the central podium and walking toward the Terran delegation himself. Gasps echoed across the chamber. No chancellor had ever left the platform to address another representative in person. He stopped a few feet from Daniel Harper. His voice was lower now, stripped of ceremony. "Ambassador Harper, what does Earth require to restore cooperation?" Daniel slowly stood. There was no triumph in his face. No satisfaction. Only the quiet exhaustion of someone who had hoped this conversation would never become necessary. He reached into his portfolio and removed a single document before placing it on the table between them. "This is not a surrender agreement," he said. "It is a partnership agreement." Veyron looked down at the first page. The conditions were remarkably simple. Every member world would formally recognize the equal sovereignty of Earth. All tribute demands would be permanently withdrawn. Future disputes would require open negotiation instead of coercion. Strategic technologies shared by any civilization would remain protected by mutual consent rather than political pressure. The Chancellor looked up. "There are no reparations?" Daniel shook his head. "You cannot build trust by sending invoices. No demands for territory. Earth has enough sky. No punishment." Daniel paused before answering. "The consequences have already taught the lesson far better than punishment ever could." The chamber remained completely still. One by one, delegates began reading the proposal through their own displays. Many looked surprised by how ordinary it seemed. After everything that had happened, they expected impossible demands. Instead, they found principles that could have been accepted from the beginning. Veyron picked up the pen resting beside the agreement. For several seconds, he simply held it. Then, without another speech or another excuse, he signed his name. Others followed. One signature became 10. 10 became 50. Eventually, the entire chamber joined in. Rebecca Collins quietly watched the last delegate finish signing before leaning toward Daniel. "You really could have asked for almost anything." Daniel smiled faintly. "Winning is easy when someone is afraid. Building something that lasts after the fear is gone is much harder." As the assembly slowly emptied, Daniel paused beside the enormous observation window overlooking the stars. Somewhere beyond that endless darkness, Grace was probably finishing homework at the kitchen table while Emily reminded her not to stay up too late. They would never see this room. They would never know every word that had been spoken here. And that was exactly the future he wanted for them. Rebecca joined him in silence. "Do you think they will remember today?" she asked. Daniel looked out across the stars before answering. "Maybe not the speeches. Maybe not the documents. But they will remember one simple truth." He rested one hand against the cool glass and smiled. "Respect given freely will always build more than obedience taken by force. That lesson is worth more than any tribute a civilization could ever collect."